Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So talking a little bit more about smallswords for a minute or two. This is a typical smallsword blade, okay, which is somewhat like a sharpened epee blade. And I have spoken in the past about how these triangular blades just can't really cut anything, and they don't really need to. They're fantastic at thrusting, very lethal with the point. They don't really need cutting capacity in general. And most small swords did evolve, even the Collie-Schmad ones with the broad base, did evolve to be these specialised thrusters because it wasn't really seen that having cutting capacity on your small sword was important. I should throw in at this point the caveat that we do see some degree of cutting in some small sword treatises, particularly Spanish ones. So it does seem that in some parts of the world, and we know from surviving examples, some small swords, particularly the earlier ones, but even some later ones, have some degree of cutting capacity. But don't think about it like cutting like you'd cut with a medieval sword or a tulwar or a cavalry sabre, not a chop. Think about it more as a slash, a draw cut, a push cut, or a distraction. And you've got to remember that whatever cut, even if you do everything to design a small sword in such a way that it can deliver a cut, it's going to have minimum or no effect at all through clothes. However, there are some exposed parts of the body. The legs only have one layer of fabric over them generally, so you're wearing some type of trousers, hose, pantaloons, whatever, and that's relatively easy to get through. But arms are usually going to have long sleeves over them. However, hands, inside or out, fingers, upper parts of necks, assuming you don't have a very tall collar, and faces, okay? So other than the point, you've got to remember that the point is always going to be easier to penetrate, and it's going to do, generally speaking, more medical damage to most people in most parts of their body than the edge will. However, if you've got the ability to cut, that could sometimes be useful, okay? A typical example would be that if I have presented my point to someone and lunged, and they have maybe pushed my point offline, in doing a circular disengage, I could come down to the thigh and do a draw cut before coming back up and presenting the point on the other side. So there are some movements where you can slip a cut into. Another example might simply be if we're doing point play and I see that the opponent's hand, or wrist or knuckles are exposed, to basically slash down from with a wrist cut down at the hand and then come back up to an engagement with the point. So there are times when you can wrap someone, essentially whip them with a sharp edge, that will prove useful either as a distraction or pain or sometimes real injury. But these swords, these triangular hollow ground blades, generally speaking, just cannot do that. However, what we must remember, and I have shown in my previous video, this exception to that rule, okay? So this is a triangular blade which does have cutting capacity because the ridge of the triangle has been put towards the back of the blade, leaving better edge geometry, and it's a fairly broad blade. This is broader than most small swords are. So you could say that this is like the love child, the hybrid, the bastard child of a spadroon and a small sword. And the result, I have to say, is pretty good. It's a pretty nice sword. But what we should point out, and here I have an example I haven't shown before because I've only recently acquired it. Some small swords were like this, and as you might be able to see, it's a double-edged blade. So what we've got here is a completely symmetrical double-edged blade with double fullers in the blade which run from there to there. So about half the total blade length is made up of fuller. But the disadvantage, so incidentally this sword will be for sale very imminently, perhaps even when you watch this video, on Eastern Antique Arms, a link below on my website. But this I believe to be a relatively early small sword, okay, so it should be I believe from about the end of the 1600s. Okay, so this is an early small sword. You'll notice it doesn't have a knuckle bow. Quite a lot of the earlier small swords don't have knuckle bows, although some do. And it's got quite large finger rings. You'll also notice it's got these little nub sort of quillons. So you can see that this has come from transitional rapiers. There is an evolution which goes from late period rapier through what's known as transitional rapier or early smallsword into the true smallsword. This is a true smallsword. It's not very big, so it's a normal smallsword size. Just compare it to, let's compare it to the Doubleedged. It's basically exactly the same size as the Doubleedged, even a little bit longer. Wire-bound hilt with Turk's head knots at top and bottom, iron pommel, iron crossguard and finger rings, and this one is fairly simple, double, like a figure eight, double shell iron guard. And it is notable that on a lot of these early smallsword blades, because they came from the rapier, so it's an evolution of the rapier, they essentially have a scaled down rapier blade, and that's what this is. Now, could this cut? Well, it's kind of sharp, although it's old and the edge hasn't been maintained, so it's not sharp enough to cut me. But could it cut? Well, you can probably hear that. Okay, that's the different sound. If I just get a triangular blade, you might be able to hear the difference. Okay, can you hear that sounds flat? That's because with a triangular blade, there's no edge really leading through the air. It's just kind of hitting the air all over the place. Whereas this one sounds like a saber blade going through the air. It's cutting the air. It's not literally cutting the air, but you know what I mean. So yeah, so essentially these are scaled down rapier blades. Could these cut? Well, to some degree. Okay. They're not going to deal wounds like a tulwar or a saber, or even a rapier. A rapier will be able to cut far more effectively than an edged smallsword. But really, just to say that edged smallswords were a thing, and they weren't only a thing in the early period. I would say that predominantly it is true to say that these edged, well, double-edged, cut and thrust smallswords were more common in the second half of the 17th century, perhaps the beginning of the 18th century. And generally speaking, later period smallswords tend to have these triangular blades like the Doubleedged here does. Okay, so these triangular blades, I think, were more successful because when you make a blade really narrow and you reduce its cutting capacity, you are at that point concentrating so much on the use of the point that anything which makes the point more effective is going to be a good thing, even if it costs you the ability to cut. So in this case, you've got a very nimble little blade and you've got a very sharp point, and you have some edges, but the price you pay by having those edges is the flexibility. Now, this is a sharp point, and I'm not pushing directly into my hand because it would stab me if I did that. But if I just balance it on my palm and push upwards, you can see the deflection in the blade, and I'm only pushing with my thumb. Okay, now it's not super flexible. It's actually less flexible than some spadroons are, but you can see how easily, sharp point into skin, how easily that deflects. If, for comparison, I won't do the Doubleedged because Doubleedgeds are even stiffer, but I'll be more fair. If I put the point carefully in my hand and push my thumb up, ow, that's about as hard as I can do it before it will penetrate me. But pushing upwards, you'll see it only deflects a tiny bit. So what you gain by having a triangular blade is a huge amount more penetrative ability and stiffness. And really, who doesn't want more stiffness? If your main objective is to penetrate a target with your tip, then really you want as much stiffness as you can possibly get, given the weight demands, okay, while still keeping it reasonably light. Obviously, if we go to the large cavalry version, that's a heavy thing, and that won't flex at all, but it's heavy and not so good for dueling. So there we go. I really think that the edged smallsword, you might think, well, why not have the ability to cut? And that's the answer, because the problem is, in order to gain the ability to cut with a blade that is this light and this narrow, what you give up is stiffness. And what they clearly found in the 18th century was that by designing swords like this, they gained a hell of a lot more stiffness and were therefore able to penetrate the target with the point much more easily. And frankly, if that is the surefire way of killing the opponent, and cutting them with a little narrow blade is going to do very little, you may as well just go for, well, just give up that ability to cut at all and concentrate all of our design on penetration. So in conclusion, it was all about deep penetration, and that's what small swords are all about, and that's one of the reasons that small swords are actually really cool. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We've got extra videos on Patreon, t-shirts on Spreadshirt, and I hope to see you for the next video.